Oh, hey.
Calling Chris Anderson in
you guess. It looks an awful like every other place I am.
Nuremberg.
No, but
Berchtesgaden.
Yes. Calling Chris Anderson in Graham in Berchtesgaden and calling Rick Beyer in. You used to look like you're in Chicago.
Yeah, I'm in Chicago. It's really boring.
You gotta get out more often.
I know, I really should. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Chris may be traveling the globe. The globe?
Globe?
Are you traveling the globe, Chris?
I'm going to try that next.
And I'm sitting here alone, but we still managed somehow to get together on Sundays to have a cocktail with you. Chris, I got a text from Matt Broggie. Our friend Matt Broggie, fellow historian, Stephen Ambrose. I want to read this text to you. I just got it this morning. Matt says, I just overheard June, my 5-year-old, tell my wife, did you know soldiers used balloon tanks and trucks to trick the bad guys? And here's the kicker, Chris. Matt doesn't remember telling her about it. Ooh, the cult. The cult is growing.
It's everywhere.
I know.
So now you immediately responded to Matt, sent him a whole box of Ghost Army swag, and right?
Good idea.
I'll get I'm kind of disappointed that she doesn't already have a pin and a T-shirt and a hat.
I know. He should be posting pictures of her with that. But I don't know. But listen, also, Chris, just to continue to rub salt into the wounds or whatever. Happy July 4th weekend. How are you celebrating?
It's the saddest day of the year.
Well,
I'm going to celebrate by having a book about our last king on the show, I think.
Well, that is a great transition to our topic today. This is an Encore episode, and we're going to bring back Andrew Roberts, who we had on in November, talking about King George III in his book,
God bless him,
The Last King of America.
See?
Yeah, but maybe not the very last one, but the last one so far.
The last one so far. You never know what's going to happen
so
next.
far. Which was a terrific show and a terrific book, which I confess that I had read about 2/3 of by the time we got the show on, but I did finish the book eventually, and just a terrific book beginning to end.
And did it change your mind about what a good king George was?
It certainly, I think, offered a lot more dimensionality to him and to the time. We're so focused on what's going on in Boston and Philadelphia and Saratoga and Kings Mountain and places like that, and to sort of see what's going on in London, and not just in Parliament, but sort of all over London, and how people are talking about this and dealing with this, and the fact that it's just one thing among many. And then the fact that his reign goes on, even before he loses his mind. He's got another good,
a few more days at the office.
10, 15 years, right? And he does a pretty good job through, despite some issues, through the French Revolution. So yeah, I would say if it didn't change my mind, it did certainly, give him a lot more respect that I think is
there
appropriate.
You go.
There you go. But I think people should find out for themselves, Chris, and the way they can do that is they can watch the show. So why don't we? Yes, we go. Why don't we get it started?
All right.
And why don't I find the open and play it? Okay, we'll edit that part out.
The bar is open.
Real bell this week.
I know, I saw that.
Real bell.
Welcome back. Well,
take it away.
Yeah, no, I'm super, super excited about this. Many of you, I hope, remember our guest Andrew Roberts had joined us much earlier in the show to talk about his biography of Winston Churchill, and at that time he hinted that something else was in the works, and that something else has arrived. And Andrew Roberts is here to talk about his new biography of George III, America's Last King. A really wonderful book, which is a game changer in historiography on George III, and should definitely cause people to think a bit about King George III. And Andrew Roberts, for those of you who don't know, is the Robert and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, a visiting professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. He's the author of definitive biographies on Winston Churchill, Napoleon Bonaparte, and a host of others. And perhaps most importantly, he's an alumnus of History Happy Hour. So with all that, welcome back, Andrew. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very kind of you. It's a little bit early to start drinking, but as I'm in Mexico, on holiday in Mexico, I've got some Mexican wine here that
Oh,
I'll be drinking in a couple of hours' time, if that's okay by you.
that will be fine by us. That will be fine by
That's
us.
fine, and we do appreciate your taking time out of your holiday to join us on History Happy Hour. It's very, very kind of you.
Yeah. So, diving right in, because it's a big book and there's lots to talk about. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson lists 28 grievances or charges against King George III that he asserts justify the action taken by the 13 colonies. Among them are that he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, that he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people, and that he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, and it goes on and on and on, and it's not very complimentary. And it kind of wraps up with a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Now, given that we're talking about old TJ, one of our founders, is he wrong?
Yes, he's completely wrong about
Okay.
about George III being a tyrant. He's not wrong. He's also wrong of those 28 charges. He's wrong on 26 of them. But the two, including one that you mentioned about taxation, and another one, in fact, about the vetoing powers of Parliament over American laws, in and of themselves justify the American Revolution. However, when you have ones like the one about eating out our subsistence, there were 40 officials who the king had sent over for customs duties, and there were 2.5 million Americans. Do 40 people really eat out the subsistence?
They had big appetites. I don't know.
2.5 million people? I think not. So actually, in chapter 13 of my book, I go through each of those charges, and as I say, two of them hold good. However, that doesn't detract in any way from the first 1/3 of the Declaration of Independence, which is written in such sublime and Shakespearean language. It makes you, proud to be human.
Yeah.
Well, Andrew, to kind of set the context for your book, I'm going to read a quote from this, and I will say this quote comes from the very last paragraph, so I don't mean to give away the whole story, but you say, well-meaning, hard-working, decent, dutiful, moral, cultured, and kind, yet cursed to lose his mind no fewer than 5 times, and also to preside over the loss of the American colonies, George III is one of the most tragic monarchs of British history, as well as being the most underestimated and misunderstood. At least he's not misunderestimated. In what ways is he underestimated and misunderstood?
Well, the loss of the American colonies were the greatest strategic catastrophe to overcome Britain between the loss of the Angevin lands in the 15th century and the fall of France in 1940. But in my book, I point out how he really cannot be blamed for this. He was a constitutional monarch who went along with his cabinet and Lord North, his prime minister, and what the majority of the House of Commons and House of Lords wanted. He was also not directly involved in the overall grand strategy of the campaign to try to defeat the American colonies, which was done by Lord George Germain. And I go into the Germain plan, which was essentially to send Sir William Howe up from the New York, up the Hudson Valley, at the same time as Sir John Burgoyne was coming south from Canada to meet at Albany, and why that plan went wrong. And he also wasn't responsible for these generals, who not only mucked up the plan, but also hated each other, were daggers drawn with the admirals, and made endless mistakes. So frankly, to hold George III responsible, as he has been by 200 years of Greek historians, for the disaster is completely unfair.
So, Andrew, what you write really big books about really big people, big characters in history. George III, I mean, that kind of came out of left field a bit. You did. I understand Napoleon, Churchill, household names. What was it about the George III story that you said I got to write that biography?
Well, I'd written about, as you say, about Napoleon, the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon and Wellington, and things like that. And so I've always been a bit interested in the person who was the longest reigning king in British history. And also, I very much felt that in recent years, we've destigmatized, thank God at last, mental illness, and that George III can now be written about in a way that doesn't blame him for his own mental collapse. And also, I did feel that he was, wildly misunderstood, as I say. So these three things came together at the same time that Her Majesty the Queen put 100,000 pages of George III's private papers into the public domain. And so in this wonderful project called the Georgian Papers Programme that King's College London and the Royal Archives have put together. And so it seemed like the ideal time to undertake a really serious re-evaluation of George III.
I want to come back to this issue of George III as a tyrant, since it's a staple of American history. And here you are, the one villain all Americans other than Chris Anderson can agree on, and you're trying to take him away from us. But I want to show you a Boston newspaper from 1769. So this is 7 years before the Declaration of Independence, and it's a story about the meeting of the Sons of Liberty in Boston. And of course, these are the folks agitating against the British government, against the Stamp Act, against all the taxation. And here are their toasts. And what is the first toast? The first toast is to the king, and the second toast is to the queen. And later on, there's a toast to permanent union between America and Britain. So when does the idea of King George as a tyrant take hold? Is that Thomas Jefferson, as Chris pointed out in the Declaration of Independence, or are there British people who are saying that as well, or is it just an American thing?
No, there are British people who are saying it as well. The radical Whigs, Edmund Burke and so on, were Charles James Fox, who called the king Satan behind his back. Even when Charles James Fox was his foreign minister, he talked to him about that.
Okay.
Exactly, and so in fact, there's this kind of what they're trying to do essentially is to clothe themselves. This is true of both Burke and of Thomas Jefferson later on, and certainly Thomas Paine and others. Trying to clothe themselves with the mantle of the revolutionaries of 1641 against Charles I and 1688 against James II. But in order to do that, you need to make George III out to be an absolutist, a believer in the divine right of kings, a sort of Stuart monarch, whereas in fact he was a limited government constitutional monarch, a Hanoverian, and he didn't believe in the divine right of kings at all. So it was a difficult sell, but nonetheless, by the time after 14 months of bloodshed in the American War of Independence between Concord and Lexington and the Declaration of Independence in July 1776, you had got to the point whereby the Americans, quite understandably for wartime propaganda reasons, have to blacken the name of the head of government of their enemy.
So Andrew, I think for most Americans, George III, he's the fully formed villain. I mean, he's made king, and he's a despot, and he's a tyrant, and all these misconceptions that we'll get into. But just so our American viewers have a better sense of who he is, kind of briefly describe kind of the family background, how that family finds itself there, and how that affects him.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. About him still being considered a tyrant, I subscribe to Google alerts for King George III. And so every time he's mentioned in America, it crops up on my phone. And so for the last 3 years that I have been researching him, hardly a day has gone by when some newspaper or some website in America doesn't call him a dictator or a despot, or the cruelty of George III and so on. And tyrant, of course, being the one that's used the most. But in fact, he was a Hanoverian, as I say. His family came over in order to be limited constitutional monarchs because the Stuarts were overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And for the next 80 years before he came to the throne, before George III came to the throne. First of all, the Whigs were in control in Britain, and his family were his great grandfather George I, who spoke no English, his grandfather George II, who spoke a little bit of English with a heavy German accent, and spent much of the year in Hanover. And then his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, who died tragically of an aneurysm when George III was 12 years old, thereby catapulting him into the position of heir to the throne. And they are a very dysfunctional lot, the Hanoverians. They all seem to hate their children, except for Frederick, Prince of Wales, who loved George III. But his grandfather and he didn't get on. And so you've got these people who are only there because they're Protestants. George I was the 51st in line to the throne, but all of the other ones couldn't take the throne because the Glorious Revolution was a Protestant revolution. And that's really the family background.
But George George III. He's the first monarch that really embraces his English
Totally, yeah,
from that family.
That's right. And in the State Opening of Parliament in 1761, he says, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." And it's one of the things that makes him popular. And also, he didn't really like Hanover. He never visited Hanover. He called it that horrid electorate in a letter to his prime minister. And so he wasn't one of those people. He was the first. He was the first king of England for about 150 years to have been born and bred and educated in Britain. So you can understand why the British people were pretty happy having him on the throne.
Yeah.
Well, and we talked about the misconception that he's a tyrant, and I think another I guess the common view of King George, he's a tyrant, he's ignorant, and he's mad. And let's save mad and insane. Let's save that for a little bit further in the broadcast. But what is he really like? Because
well, he's certainly not ignorant. That's another huge misconception, which I'm afraid still exists today. There are books about him being thick, basically. But this is a boy who's able to write in Latin at the age of 8, who speaks 4 languages, who plays 4 musical instruments, and who writes a series of essays, rather brilliant essays, on subjects like Montesquieu's Essays on the Laws in the 1750s, and who, as Prince of Wales, in fact, wrote an essay, which I use as one of the illustrations of my book, in fact, on slavery, completely denouncing the arguments for slavery. I wonder if I could just read you one sentence from it. Where he says, and this is the 1750s, he says, "What shall we say for a European traffic in black slaves? The very reasons urged for it will be perhaps sufficient to make us hold such practice in execration for an inhuman custom, wantonly practiced by the most enlightened, polite nations in the world. There is no occasion to answer them, for they stand self-condemned." And that is not the work of an ignorant person. That's the work of an actually very thoughtful person, it strikes me.
And how old was he when he wrote that?
We don't have the exact date, but it was in the 1750s when he was Prince of Wales, so he would have been in his 20s.
Okay.
Or perhaps his late teens, but around that time.
Yeah.
And yet he's treated, and he never bought or sold a slave in his life. He never bought any shares or owned any shares in the companies that did that. He signed the legislation that abolished the slave trade in 1807, and yet he's been constantly treated on the same, on a lower moral plane, essentially, from the founding fathers, 41 of whom, of the signatures, of the 56 signatories of the Declaration of Independence, did own slaves. So I think we've got a man here who is
Zing.
Understood. So what did you say, Rick? I didn't catch that.
I said zing, yes. Right. Okay. Isn't there a Samuel Johnson quote about this? That why is it that the drivers of slaves are the ones who whelp the loudest about liberty?
Yes. It's in the book. I can't remember the exact.
Close enough.
Yeah.
So you say that, again, I'm just quoting, George III did not believe in the divine right of kings, but he did believe in the near divinity of the English Constitution, which again is not a charge that you generally hear associated with him.
Yeah.
And then you go on to say that all George wanted was to preserve the constitutional status quo.
Well, it did give him a lot of powers, of course. The British Constitution of 1688, the one that came in at the time of the Revolution, did give the king very, very wide and profound powers. But I saw the other day in the Harvard Law Review last April, it actually argued that, in fact, the present imperial presidency of America actually has the president has longer, bigger, stronger powers than George III.
Well, yeah. We're not going to get into anything after 1830 in this broadcast today. You offer a great window in this book into British politics, policies, thinking during the run-up to the Revolution. I mean, your focus really is that the title, The Last King of America, really alludes to the fact that a big part of this book is kind of about what's happening and how it relates to what's happening in America. And what struck me is two things. One is how young the king is. I mean, in 1765, when the Stamp Act is passed, I think he's 27 years old. And also the fact that London is having, and Britain is having, its own set of domestic crises. Political discord, a merry-go-round of ministers coming in and out, mob violence. We talk about the Boston Massacre, but British troops are firing on a mob in London and killing more people than were killed in the Boston Massacre. How much did domestic concerns distract George and his various governments from the American situation?
Yes, that's a very good question. You see, he comes to becomes king towards the middle of a world war, the 7 Years' War. Some historians called, the First World War, which is fought against the French and Spanish in the West Indies and the East Indies and the Mediterranean and the Channel and all over the European continent. And it's an extremely expensive war, and it doubles the national debt. And as a way of trying to pay that off, or at least to replenish it, the coffers in some way, they come up with this Stamp Act idea to try and raise a very small amount of money. In fact, it was only between £40,000 and £60,000, which was about 2 shillings and sixpence per American per year. But unfortunately, it fell on the most eloquent people in society, the journalists and the lawyers. And somebody once wrote that you should never pick a fight with somebody who buys ink by the barrel. And that's what Lord North. Well, sorry, it wasn't Lord North at that stage. It was George Grenville did, and. So yes, it was, even though all of the money that was going to be raised by the Stamp Act was going to be spent in America, actually, protecting Americans.
So, and obviously Americans like to think that they're the center of the universe with some, justification. And when they're looking at the Revolution and George III, their focus is on his relationship to America. Given the amount of time you spent with him and the research you did with these papers, do you have any sense as the conflict is approaching what his attitude towards the colonies was? I mean, how did he view the Americas?
Well, he certainly didn't have this sort of ignorance of the colonies that he's constantly made out to have. He bought maps about the colonies whenever a senior American was over in Britain. He had audiences with them. He bought lots of books about America and read them. So, it wasn't as though he had some kind of disdainful, sneering stance like the one that you get from Hamilton the musical. But equally, he didn't have any first-hand knowledge of America. I never went there, of course. And quite a few of his royal governors were immensely misleading when they wrote to him about America. They gave him completely appalling advice on a regular basis, which was a surprise, really, because these people were actually living in America and working with Americans every day.
So why do you think there was? I'm sorry. Why do you think there was such a misconnect? Because I know, as you point out, there were plenty of Americans in London, and there's interchange, and people are aware of the colonies. How did they get it so wrong?
Well, they got it so wrong because they didn't believe, in the case of Massachusetts, especially in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, that the Americans were going to stay united. They thought that they would distance themselves from Massachusetts and leave Massachusetts to be coerced by the intolerable acts. And that could not have been more wrong. The royal governors got that completely wrong. And there were people, as you say, in Britain, and lots of Americans in Britain, including obviously Benjamin Franklin, and quite a few. There was something like 17 Americans in the House of Commons as well, and their views on this tended to be, not Benjamin Franklin's, but quite a few of the others, tended to be very sort of dismissive about the dangers involved. And to go back to what Rick asked, there was there was a sort of disconnect at the top of government. Lord North was much more worried, for example, about keeping his ministry together over the land tax and over imprisoning John Wilkes, which took the minds of the government off what was happening in America at an absolutely crucial moment. So yes, but I don't think these things can be blamed primarily, or at least significantly, on George III, because this was the job of the politicians.
Right. There's a wonderful eye-opening passage in your book, and you suggest that perhaps George III should have considered visiting the colonies, that if he had, things might have gone a different way. And you actually go beyond that and suggest that he should have considered or contemplated moving here permanently. And that rocked my world a little bit to see that suggestion. It's fascinating, kind of what if thinking. How practical might it have been? What might it have accomplished?
I mean, if you think about it, the Hanoverians had only been in England since 1714. So, if in 1765, only 41 years later, they had got up and moved across to an even bigger and as it turned out, much greater and more powerful and wealthy continent, then they'd have just been doing a little bit more carpet bagging 41 years later. I mean, if George III had been able to see what America had become by 1876, he'd have done it in a flash, and let alone 1976. So it was an extraordinary thing. Not that he didn't go to America, because it was a very, very major undertaking to have royal visits. But the thing was, he never went anywhere at all. He was King of Scotland, he never went to Scotland. He was King of Ireland, he never went to Ireland. He was Elector of Hanover, he never went to Hanover. He never went to the north of England or the Midlands. The most far north he ever went was Worcester, and he never went west of Plymouth. So basically, he spent his entire life really in the home counties of England.
So,
and he had this. And this is the thing. You see, this is one of the things that I found so fascinating, was that he had this extreme intellectual curiosity. His collection of maps, his extraordinary library. I'm sure we'll come on to all his culture, his interest in culture, and so on later on in the broadcast too. But he had this intellectual curiosity, and yet he didn't actually seem to need to indulge it himself by actually going to see anything. He never went down a coal mine in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, and I was fascinated by that contrast, and I also, I'm sure some people are saying, well, that's ridiculous to think about, the king being able to even visit America. But I would also point out that in about a 2 or 3 year period at this time, that General John Burgoyne crosses the Atlantic Ocean 6 times by ship, going back and forth between the Americas and the UK. It's not a moonshot in 1775. It's a long journey. It's got some dangers to it, but it isn't as extreme as it would have been in 1675.
No, that's right. And of course, he'd have to have gone with an entourage and so on. I mean, it would have to have been a sort of pretty massive undertaking. But his grandfather, George III, spent 3 months a year in Hanover. He would just get up and bring the entire court over to Germany for 3 months. And you could easily get well, not easily, but you could have got to America and back inside of 3 months.
Or at least, yeah, at least 4 to 6. And of course, you might say, well, Hanover's closer, but there's no phone, there's no internet. It's still he's gone, and we're sending letters and waiting for a response.
Exactly. Actually, of course, the tyranny of distance is the real tyranny, rather than George III's, because it does take 6 weeks to get an order or a cabinet decision or anything along those lines from Britain to America, and then sometimes even longer coming back again. So you do get this problem that the Americans in the war are able to react instantaneously to changing events, whereas for big decisions, the British are hamstrung.
So, what do you think? Obviously, a very big topic, but you deal with it marvelously in the book. What do you think are the causes or the things that finally push this to the point that it reaches? It's not taxation without representation, is it?
No, not least because actually the South Carolinians and the Virginians went to the Stamp Act Congress with their delegates with the orders not to accept representation if it were offered. So you can't really complain too much about no taxation without representation if you're going to say no to representation. But yes, exactly. But no, I think the real reason behind the American Revolution is what strikes me as the obvious one, is that by the 1760s, early 1770s, you've got a country of 2.5 million people. You've got a burgeoning economy. It's growing 7% year on year. You've got more bookshops in Philadelphia than any city in the empire, apart from London. You've got no external threat from 1763 because the French have been thrown off the North American continent. The nearest French army is in Haiti. So, this is the opportunity for the Americans, and they quite rightly felt that this was their moment to take self-government and independence, and the advantages of self-government and independence are very clear, as we can see from what happened to America, after it won the war.
Right, and you also say, I'd like to get kind of more of your thought on, in the book you say that the North American colonists were not British, but they were Britons.
That's right, yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they were often born in Britain, a lot of them, certainly their parents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents and so on were. Their language was English, their common law was identical, their assumptions about representative institutions, the various regional legislatures that they had were very obviously based on the Westminster Parliament. George Washington bought his shoes and the glass for his coach and all sorts of things, and his false teeth from London, and continued to do after the hostilities had started. Actually, interestingly enough, yes, and as Rick showed right with that document earlier on, they would toast the king and the royal family. So in that sense, they were British, even if they weren't, of course, Britons.
Yeah.
So you have some very charming stories about his kind of personal touch. I got a sense of George III, the person, from your book more than I've ever seen anywhere before. And I mean, some of the stories were the kind of this isn't exactly accurate, but the king in disguise stories, or where he meets someone who doesn't recognize him, but also some of the stories about his interactions with artists and scientists. And so I know this is kind of two slightly different areas, but can you give us a sense of his personality through that and his interests through that?
Yes, that's right. I mean, it wasn't that he was in disguise, of course. He just dressed as an English country gentleman, when the Bourbons were dressing up like Christmas trees. So you have very much the sense of him being able to go around without an entourage, chatting to farmers about the price of pigs and so on. And they would later find out that it was the king who they were talking to. So he had the common touch, and he went on sort of royal walkabouts. He also had a sense of humour. It wasn't a brilliant sense of humour, frankly. This book is not full of George III gags in the way that my
Churchill book. Yeah.
And Napoleon was a very funny man as well. There were lots of good Napoleon jokes as well. George III's jokes were pretty, what one might call Hanoverian. But there's that old Mel Brooks line: "What's the opposite of comedy? Germany." And you get that kind of sense. But nonetheless, luckily, the book is full of jokes, because it was the height of the period of parliamentary repartee and wit. And people like Charles James Fox and William Pitt the Younger and Edmund Burke and people were extremely sort of witty and funny people.
Well, so I'm going to jump in with a follow,
okay,
Chris. I'm sorry, because I'm going to come back to the second half of that question,
right.
Andrew, which is also because he is not uninterested in theater. He is not uninterested in science. He is not uninterested in art, and he plays a kind of a very kingly role in all those areas.
That's right. No, I think he's amongst the sort of top three most cultured monarchs. And in order to be a tyrant, you have to be a cruel despot, according to the 18th century term of the word, of which there were many. The Catherine the Great in Russia, what the French were doing in Corsica, what the Spanish were doing in Louisiana, and so on. And he isn't that kind of cruel person. He's got a really interesting cultured side. His books are the centre. His 80,000 book library is the centre and the kernel of the British Library. He founded the Royal Academy. He was a great supporter, obviously, of the Georgian neoclassical architectural tradition, with the great architects that he helped. He also helped buy the world's largest telescope, and the planet Uranus was originally named after him. He played 4 musical instruments. He invited Haydn and Handel and Mozart to play in Britain. This is not what Tom Paine called the royal brute of Britain. It's the exact opposite of a brute, really. It's somebody who has sort of profound artistic interest. He actually built up the largest collection of scientific instruments in the world, there's nothing brutish about that.
So one of the questions I have, and this, I apologize, it comes from when I was very young. In looking at the start of the revolution, just jumping back to that really quickly, we have all these problems. You have the Sons of Liberty. They're, pushing this idea of revolution and independence. Why doesn't George III crack down on these people? Like, obviously they had done so in Scotland in 1745, you could argue. Why didn't they just say, all right, just arrest them all and we're going to be done with this?
I know, it's interesting. This was because he wasn't a tyrant, is the answer to that. No, you're right. I mean, he never arrests an editor. He never closes a newspaper. In America, he never, apart from Boston in 1768, he never sends troops to any of the cities. And he allows the Stamp Act Congress and the First Continental Congress to meet completely unhindered. And so, it's not that they didn't keep their eye on the ball. It's that they tended to assume that the sort of English common law would be able to be work out in almost all circumstances. And of course, there was a radical Whig tradition in Westminster that supported the Americans in all of this. But you're right. I mean, he did. They were quite weak and pusillanimous early on, and then, of course, in 1774, with the Intolerable Acts, they go too far in the other direction, and try to hobble the Massachusetts Bay province and also, of course, Boston itself.
So I think it's maybe time to address a question that a number of people have asked about, and it's also a big part of George III's legacy, which is his mental illness. Because when you bring up King George, oh, the Mad King. I mean, somehow we always use words like mad and madness instead of more scientific terms.
Yeah.
What were his mental health problems, as far as you can determine?
Yeah.
When did they start? Give us a précis of this as a starting point here.
Yes, they started in, well, actually, I disagree with most of the other, in fact, I think all the other historians on this, because they think that it was a disease called porphyria that he suffered from, a physiological disease. In about 2010, this theory was completely undermined by some brilliant research by doctors who pointed out that the mother and son team back in the late 1960s who came up with this theory had given some terribly misleading symptoms to the doctors who therefore diagnosed porphyria. I'm afraid quite a lot of this is to do with the colour of the king's urine and feces, it's
excellent.
Thank you. Well, you've got to say it. There's no other way around it. And as the 5 or 6 pages of my appendix point out, in fact, it's a complete myth. He did not have porphyria. What he actually had, and I've also used the top medical professionals and experts for this, the president of the Royal Society of Medicine, the president of the Royal Society of Psychiatry are actually the same person, Sir Simon Wesley, but other doctors as well, including porphyria doctors. And what they say and what the new medical peer-reviewed journals say is that he had manic depression. In particular, it was the bipolar disorder, affective type 1. And that led him to babble, to occasionally become violent, to talk for 24 hours, to foam at the mouth. And he had, I believe, 5 attacks. Most historians put it down to only 4, but the first one, the prodrome attack of 1765, it seems to me, and obviously do read my book and see whether you agree. I'd be interested what your readers feel about this, because it strikes me that there is an attack in 1765, but then there's no attack at all until 5 years after America has been independent. So the Mad King George, who was mad and therefore the revolution broke out, is completely wrong. He wasn't. He was sane entirely until 5 years after the American War of Independence had been lost.
And one just quick follow-up on that. We had a person who asked about that they had heard a program in colonial Williamsburg that it had been might have been related to lead poisoning, but no evidence on that.
No, it's a psychological disease. It's not. You don't get foaming at the mouth and babbling for days because of lead poisoning, do you?
Too much Red Bull, but not lead poisoning.
You shouldn't have. I shouldn't have told Rick that story.
I'll stop.
Well, no, don't. I mean, your readers are going to want, your listeners are going to want to know what on earth you're talking about. Now.
Well, you have said that you have said that you're a big consumer of Red Bull when you're on a writing tear to kind of keep you going. And actually, when we started the show, the very first question that somebody posted up was. How many cans of Red Bull do you drink? So obviously people remember this from the last time you were here.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, too many. I have one a day at lunchtime to keep me. This is only when I'm writing the book. This is not like now when I'm.
You're not in Mexico popping the Red Bull.
No, exactly. Or when I'm researching the book or anything like that. This is solely when I'm in the zone and I need to write 4,000 or 5,000 words a day. And I need to get the book done, and so then I'll have one at lunchtime, and it'll keep me sort of working and thinking and buzzing basically until supper. So
There you go.
whereas usually I try to have a Churchillian nap in the afternoon.
But no babbling or foaming at the mouth that you are aware of. Okay, very good.
So, you say in the book that the concept of honor is central to our understanding of George III, and he would not allow his own to be compromised. And then you're quoting something that his father had written for him that he kind of took to heart. It says, "Never give up your honor nor that of the nation." How did George view honor, and how did this view kind of affect his reign, how he ruled?
Yes, it was a very powerful sense of honor and also dignity, the royal dignity that he felt sometimes came under attack. If he had promised somebody that they're going to be Lord Privy Seal of Scotland, and the Prime Minister then prevents that person from becoming Lord Privy Seal of Scotland, George III felt that his honour had been impugned. And as a result, all hell broke loose, frankly, and the Prime Minister could wind up losing his job. Indeed, on one occasion, did for that precise reason. So he felt that being king meant that he was personifying the nation, and that sort of slurs and attacks on him were also sometimes slurs and attacks on the nation. And which brings us on to John Wilkes, the radical journalist, who the government tried to imprison for seditious libel, for saying that the king's mother was sleeping with the Prime Minister, Lord Bute, which she was not. But if anything is seditious and libelous, it must be that the king's mother is sleeping with the Prime Minister. It's pretty much the sort of definition of seditious libel. But George III was wrong in trying to punish John Wilkes for this, because all that happened was that the people of Middlesex kept re-electing Wilkes. Wilkes was then suspended and disbarred from the House of Commons. And then he would stand again and he would be re-elected again. And this happened 4 times, and it became a complete sort of farce. And the king ultimately looked stupid.
Well, and the interesting follow-up that I want to bring back this dinner from 1769, where the king and the queen are the first 2 toasts, and number 4 is Alderman Wilkes. So there's John Wilkes is presented as the number 4 toast there. So they're saying, yes, we love the king, but also we love this person who really is attacking the king. So it's a little bit of perhaps hypocrisy there. Not that ever occurred in any other political documents from that time or any other, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I'm going to bring a question from the audience here, from Frank Cook, and he wants to know, did King George and Member of Parliament William Wilberforce have any interaction relative to the successful abolishment of the African slave trade and slavery itself in the British Empire? And of course, Wilberforce was a big one of the powers behind the eventual abolition of the slave trade, which I'm going to say took place around 1807, I think it was.
That's right. Yes, he did. They spoke at a audience where the king asked Wilberforce how his campaign was coming along for abolition. But the king did not do anything to support abolition. This was partly because he was a constitutional monarch, as I say, and he knew that there was no majority in the Commons or the Lords for abolition until 1807. And of course, the actual slavery itself wasn't abolished in his lifetime at all. That we had to wait until 1833 for that. But it was also because he frankly put realpolitik before his duties as a Christian. He was a very devout and pious Anglican, and yet he allowed the slave trade to continue because about a third of the government revenues came from the West Indies, and nobody, and this is a terrible indictment really on those people in the late 18th century, nobody could work out an economic model whereby you could profitably make sugar with free people rather than with slaves. And so So George III does have a blot on his escutcheon and his reputation for not being more active. But as I say, as a constitutional monarch, he didn't consider it his duty to be active on every issue of the day.
All right. So speaking of kind of black marks or issues, again, given how much time you spent with him, we have a totally new picture of this person, his effectiveness as a monarch. Are there things that you saw as you were studying him that you said, boy, he just didn't get that right, or that was kind of a failure on his part, or where did he go wrong?
Well, he was very self-righteous. It's an unattractive feature of his personality that that he never really accepted that he had got things wrong. He occasionally did. He would say, after the expedition to Egypt in the Napoleonic Wars was a big success, and he'd been against it. He did sort of ting a glass at a dinner party and tell everybody that Henry Dundas, whose house he was in, had been right and he'd been wrong. But that's a fairly rare occurrence, and otherwise he tended to blame all the politicians for things that he had agreed with them on at the time. He was, as I say, his sense of humour. He did tell jokes, but I really only about 5, and none of them were funny.
But that's 4 more than I found with George Washington.
Actually, I tell you what, that is one positive, really positive thing about George III. I thought was that the way in which he said of George Washington when Washington gave up the presidency in March 1797 that he was the greatest character of the age. I think that was a rather splendid thing to say. And can I just read the sentence or 2 sentences he said to John Adams when in
Absolutely.
June.
You should explain the context. Adams is ambassador. Yes.
He's the first American ambassador to London. It's June 1785, and he comes to present his credentials to the king at an audience at St James's Palace. And the king says, "I will be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation. But the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, and I say now, that I will be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power."
I've always been, that moment of John Adams meeting with King George III is one of the very handful of historic moments I would like to have been there before. I always thought that must be the emotions going on in both men must have been tremendous.
Yeah, it's a great fly on the wall moment, isn't it?
Yes, and it happens in you explain this in your book is the closet, but or I think that one is in the closet, but that is his sort of private meeting space, but it's called the closet, which is I found kind of interesting.
It's his sort of study behind the big audience chamber at St James's Palace. And the most extraordinary thing is about the meetings in the audience chamber and also the closet is that they take place standing up. And there's one point where William Pitt the Younger, who's Prime Minister, of course, for 18 years, at the end of George III's reign, or towards the end at least, he stands up for 3.5 hours as they talk to one another. They at no point sit down. And he never had dinner with William Pitt the Younger in all of that time as well. So it was a strange way of governing, really.
Well,
go ahead.
So one of the things I think, again, our viewers would benefit from, they will certainly benefit from it when they read your book. What happens after the revolution? Because again, most Americans think, okay, we've gotten our independence and George III is just doing whatever it is that he's doing, but he's still got a lot of years left.
Well, I mean, the key thing, of course, is that he does have his worst fit of, sort of second worst fit of madness in 1788, and then, fortunately, after about 4 months of this, 5 months of this, he gets better in the April of 1789, just in time for the French Revolution. And had the Prince Regent been in charge, and he was going to sack William Pitt the Younger and bring in Charles James Fox, we would have had a government that actually approved of the French Revolution, and was all in favour of it. So it was a really touch and go thing, frankly.
Andrew Roberts, King George has been called a tyrant for 250 years. The most recent version of this is the character who appears in Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical I Am.
I've seen that already. I saw that when you did it before.
He just chose not to mention it.
Rubbing it in.
No, exactly, yeah.
And
I love that show, by the way. My toes were tapping through those songs. They were absolute show-stopping songs. I love them.
So he sings, and you mentioned this in your book, pointing out it's totally wrong. But I will kill your friends and family to remind you of my love. So you have this long-standing view of King George. Can you turn the tide?
Yeah, if enough people read the book, of course I can. Absolutely. If I partly go on podcasts such as this because it's very charming to chat to you guys, but I also obviously want people to read the book and to engage with the arguments and to see whether or not they think that I'm right, that he wasn't a tyrant, and then for that to be the standard opinion, rather than the one which I think mistakes wartime propaganda for what was true and what was happening on the ground at the time.
So, which then means that we don't have a real understanding because we have a misunderstanding of the history because of that little bit.
Exactly, and that's why he's the most misunderstood monarch, as the subtitle implies.
So I have a question that I want to ask. This comes out of our last interview. So at our last interview, I wanted to ask you about, how you picked your next topic, and you were like, "Oh no," because you were writing this book, and I phrased it poorly. What I was trying to get at, and what I'd like to get your opinion on, you write a lot of great biographies, definitive biographies of important people.
Thank you very much.
Is there something about a biography that helps you tell a historical tale better, or is there something about the craft of biography that you're drawn to? What is it about?
Golly, that is an interesting question. I suppose if you're going to spend 3 years with somebody, or 6 years in the case of Lord Salisbury and Napoleon, you obviously must be fascinated by them, but at the same time you must feel that there's something new to say, something interesting to say, something worthwhile to make those years of your life worthwhile. And so far, and I don't know, but this is probably pure luck, so far I haven't ever got halfway through a biography and thought, oh, this person is absolutely boring and dreadful, and I don't know why I've dedicated so much time to him or her. And I'm not very good at choosing my own subjects for books. Interestingly, I've had my first wife chose one, my parents chose one, my agent's chosen one, my present wife's chosen one, a friend from Wisconsin called Jim Barry chose this George III idea. My publishers have chosen books that I've written, and I'm slightly nerve-wracked now that if I choose a biography for myself, it's going to be a disaster.
So you're asking us to send you our suggestions after the show. And our History Happy Hour viewers, this is your chance. What is Andrew Roberts' next book, or the one after that perhaps? Let him know. We'll pass them along.
I can tell you what I am doing the one after this on, though. I've got one, a biography of Lord Northcliffe, the press baron, but he's very much just, I think, of interest to Britons. He controlled 40% of the British press at the outbreak of the Great War and brought down Asquith and put in Lloyd George and so on. So he's a very interesting figure for Britons, but I don't think it's going to have a much wider appeal internationally. But the one after that is going to be Disraeli. I'm going to do a proper 4-year cradle to the grave life of Disraeli. I mean, I can do history books, I hasten to add, as well as.
Oh, absolutely, no. But I just, I noticed that the ones that you
Yeah.
see our your biography, and I was just curious.
If History
about
Happy Hour is still going on in 4 years or whenever the Disraeli book
There
is
we go.
finished, we will certainly welcome you back on then. And I want to just put up the cover here and say Andrew Roberts is the author of The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. It's a big book, but it's a really fascinating
It's
book
wonderful.
and eye-opening. And you know, I tried skipping through. You just can't. You just have to keep reading. It's too good.
That's really good.
Andrew Roberts, thank you so
Thank you,
much for
Andrew
joining
Roberts.
us on the program today. And enjoy your time in Mexico and your travels in the United States.
You are kind. Thank you very much indeed. It's been great being on the show again. Thank you.
All right,
Thank
take
you.
care.
Enjoy.
Bye. Here, you start talking this time. I'm tired of being the one who starts talking.
You always, but you love to talk, Rick.
I do love to talk. So do you.
So we're
Chris.
talking now.
You
But
you
no, I
do
just
not.
want to thank you, Rick, for taking up my suggestion that we do the show with Andrew Roberts on this, the saddest day of the year. Kind of lifted my spirits a bit.
Are you headed out to Buckingham Palace to petition the Queen to take America back, or?
Well, I have that note that says we're very sorry. It was all a big mistake, and if you wouldn't mind, I know you've got some room now in the Commonwealth. Some countries have left, so what do you
Right,
think?
right, and it could be like a good antidote to Brexit, right?
Right, exactly. It would fill the
Could be
void.
American entrance. No.
and I have my pink highlighter, so we could color in the map again properly. We'll be all set.
Well done, well done. Listen, we want to make sure that we give a big thank you to all of the people who support our efforts on
Absolutely.
Patreon.
Yes, very much so.
And especially our top shelf patrons. And, we as Chris likes to point out, we can make that font smaller. We can fit more names there.
much smaller.
We do need your assistance to keep the show going and to manage to do this. And so if you can join us, please go to patreon.com/historyhappyhour and go ahead and do that. And Chris, what's up next week? We're back live.
Well, it's been weeks and weeks since we've talked about Nazis. So I think we
back to Nazis.
Back to Nazis. Right.
All right. Yes, we have
Fascists that just keep on giving. Yes.
we have a book, Nazis on the Potomac, which does sound vaguely disturbing, although I believe the Nazis in question are imprisoned German
Yes.
generals during
Safely
World
behind
War II.
bars. Yes.
And it's kind of the American equivalent of a story we touched on earlier in the history of History Happy Hour with Helen Fry. But this is a book, Nazis on the Potomac, by Robert Sutton, and we'll have Robert Sutton on to talk to you about it. And it should be good to get back to that, and it's a fascinating
Yes.
topic. So.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting angle in that whole story. So
All right. Well, until next week, Chris.
stay safe, everyone.